The God is here. Know what I mean? It's going down. Album is crazy. It's fire. Can't nobody stop it.
You know, it's always some controversy with Fat Joe. Now that 300
Always
joint is out.
controversy with Fat Joe, huh?
And we love you for it because you
Tell it. I heard his album is trash too. I heard that 50 joint is garbage. You know, I just think he should diss me on a hot record.
Okay.
You know, because that is real whack, that record, to be honest with you. Like, the is trash, to be honest with you. The record is whack. It is trash, to be honest with you. The record is whack.
Before the platinum plaques and fame, he was just Joseph Cartagena, Joey Crack, a kid from the Bronx who survived something most people never could. When he was just 10 years old, his own father tried to take his life. Years later, long before any record deal and fame, a $10 dispute would end with 2 bullets in his body.
A guy that shot at you 8 times in like 2 days.
The Ecuadorian.
Yeah.
There's nothing more scary than having a guy on your shooting at you 8 times in 2 days.
And the danger didn't stop there. It followed him into fame. Loyalty turned deadly, friendships blurred into threats, and at one point, even 50 Cent's life hung in the balance.
I just want to bust them new teeth that got wide open, B.
This is where the story begins. Long before the world called him Fat Joe, Joseph Antonio Cartagena was just a terrified 10-year-old boy growing up in the South Bronx during one of its darkest times. The Bronx of the 1970s wasn't just poor, it was burning. Entire blocks were abandoned. Apartment buildings were set on fire for insurance money, rats, broken glass, and sirens filled the nights. Joe's family lived in forest projects, a place where survival wasn't a choice. It was the only way to live. Every day, he saw people fighting, stealing, or running from police. Violence wasn't shocking, it was normal. Inside his home, things were just as hard. His father, a man from Puerto Rico, worked long hours, but carried a deep anger that never seemed to fade. Joe would later say his father's temper was like a storm, one second calm, the next ready to explode. His mother tried to keep peace in the house, but the shouting and fights became part of Joe's daily life.
We could have diagnosed him with everything. He come home after being drunk and playing poker and losing all his money, and my moms would wake up 3 in the morning, cook him a steak, cook him some food.
Wow.
And he would eat it and be like, it's too much salt, and throw the plate against the wall. Yeah. Now, I'm a kid watching this type of stuff.
Then came the night that would scar him forever. Joe was only 10 years old when his father lost control completely. Nobody knows what started it. Maybe money, maybe frustration, but that night, his father snapped and came after him with deadly rage. Joe ran. He was terrified, running through the apartment, trying to escape the man who was supposed to protect him. His father tried to kill him. Joe later said that moment changed everything inside him. When your own father tries to take your life, fear stops being something you feel, it becomes something you fight. From that night on, Joe promised himself that nobody would ever make him feel helpless again. He wouldn't cry, he wouldn't run. If the world was violent, he'd be more violent. If the world was cold, he'd turn to stone. That was the birth of the fighter. After that, Joe's relationship with his father was broken. His mother did her best to raise him and his siblings, but the damage was done. The boy who once loved to draw and joke around became angry and guarded. He stopped trusting people. He stopped caring about rules. In the Bronx, respect was survival, and Joe was ready to take it however he could. By 12, he was already on the corners. He sold small things like candy, then clothes, then whatever made money. The streets became his new classroom. He learned how to hustle, how to talk tough, and how to read danger. He also learned about loyalty, that in the streets, loyalty wasn't about friendship, it was about who would stand with you when everything went wrong. But trouble came fast. Joe had a big mouth and an even bigger pride. He fought anyone who disrespected him. Older kids noticed he didn't back down. Some liked that. Others saw him as a target. Every day was a test. Either you fought or got walked over. Joe was known for having controversies.
You know, it's always some controversy with Fat Joe. Now that 300
Always
joint is out.
controversy with Fat Joe, huh?
And we love you for it because you
Tell it.
There was one man in the neighborhood who saw something in him, Charlie Rock LD. Charlie was older, already respected, already feared. He'd been to prison, and his name carried weight in the Bronx. When he looked at young Joe, he didn't just see a kid, he saw someone who could hold his own. Charlie took him under his wing, teaching him how to survive the streets, how to stand his ground, and how to never let fear show. It was a dangerous education. Charlie showed Joe the side of the Bronx most people never walked into: the guns, the robberies, the revenge. Joe started carrying himself differently. The quiet boy was gone. In his place was someone ready for war at any time.
I was the one that showed him the street life, and I gave him his first burner, how I taught him the ropes. You know, he was my son. I had him under the wing. You know, I would never get him in trouble.
But behind the anger was still that little boy who had once been chased by his own father. He just didn't know it yet. All the fights, all the street bravado, they were armor. Joe had learned to live like his heart didn't feel pain, but every time he saw another family laughing or a father walking with his son, something deep down hurt. Still, he pushed it away. Pain was weakness, and weakness got you killed. By the time he was 15, Joe's name was known across forest projects. People respected him, some feared him. He'd earned a reputation for standing tall no matter what. But the line between respect and danger was thin. Once you were known, people wanted to test you, and in the Bronx, one small argument could turn deadly. Years later, Joe would admit that everything started from that night with his father, that near-death moment that turned him from a scared child into someone who thought survival meant fighting forever. He didn't realize it then, but that fire inside him would one day build his empire and nearly destroy it too. By the time Joseph Cartagena turned 16, the Bronx had already turned him into a soldier. The same blocks that once terrified him now moved around him with respect. Everyone in forest projects knew the kid who didn't back down, but with that respect came pressure to prove himself every single day. The streets were like a job with no breaks. Every sunrise meant another test, another chance to lose your life over pride. And in that world, Joe was climbing fast. He had muscle, he had presence, and most importantly, he had Charlie Rock LD beside him, the man who had become his father, his teacher, and his shield. Charlie had already served time. He was a legend in the Bronx for taking a shank to the eye during a prison fight and surviving. When he talked, people listened. When he walked with Joe, nobody bothered them. But Charlie's lessons weren't about peace. They were about dominance. He taught Joe how to hold the block, how to handle disrespect, and how to make fear your protection. In these streets, Charlie told him, you don't ask for respect, you take it. Under Charlie's guidance, Joe's world expanded. He joined the local crew that would later evolve into Terror Squad. But back then, it wasn't about music. It was about territory, money, and power. They weren't the biggest gang in New York, but they had the Bronx on lock. If you crossed them, you paid for it.
Once I showed them how to rob people, from there we went into the drug game, and he used to be my little runner. I took care of Joe, man. Joe can't say no negative about Charlie Rock.
Joe became known as the enforcer. He wasn't the biggest, but he hit hard and didn't hesitate. People started calling him Joey Crack, not because he sold drugs, but because he was cracking heads open. He took pride in that name. It made him feel untouchable, like the fear he once felt as a child was gone for good. But the streets have a way of reminding you who's really in control. One afternoon, everything changed. Joe got into an argument over something stupid, $10. The man he was arguing with pulled a gun and fired. Joe felt 2 burning shocks in his body before he hit the ground. He'd been shot twice, once in the arm, once in the leg over a debt that wasn't even his.
I got shot by the biggest coward. When I got shot, the guy who shot me's puss. But the guy owed me $10 and I kept harassing him. I was picking on him so much, bullying the guy.
He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he just looked at the sky and realized how fast the street could erase you. 1 second you're feared, the next you're bleeding on the concrete. That shooting changed him again. He survived, but it left him colder, more alert. From then on, he started moving differently. Every handshake, every conversation, every car that slowed near him, he studied it. He was learning the most important rule of the Bronx: trust no one completely. When he healed, he went right back outside. To him, staying inside meant weakness, and weakness got you shot again. By the late 1980s, Joey Crack had become one of the most respected names in forest projects. He had a little money, flashy clothes, and a crew that followed him everywhere. But behind the bravado, something new was forming a hunger to escape. Joe had seen too many people die young. The funerals, the revenge shootings, the mothers crying on the sidewalks. It was a cycle that never ended. Deep down, he wanted out, but he didn't know how. Music found him by accident. Joe was always into rap, the block parties, the DJs, the rhymes that echoed through the Bronx. He'd freestyle on corners just to pass time. People laughed at first, but his flow was raw, confident, and authentic. He rapped like someone who had seen everything. Local DJs started inviting him to perform. His voice was deep, his presence commanding. He didn't rap about fantasies, he rapped about what he'd lived. The beat was his new weapon. Charlie Rock LD supported him, but the streets didn't believe in dreams. Every time Joe performed, he risked being seen as soft. In the Bronx, nobody respected rappers. They respected gangsters, but Joe wasn't trying to impress anymore. For the first time, he wanted something that didn't involve guns or violence. Still, the streets didn't let go easily. Even as his reputation grew, he was still surrounded by the same people, the same wars. Friends turned on friends. Cops were always watching. Rivals wanted revenge. The more his name spread, the bigger the target on his back became. Charlie got arrested and Joe stepped up his game.
Once I got arrested, him and Tone stepped up and they made some money. But as far as like that, being a gangster and putting in work, Joe was never known for that. You know what I mean?
Joe's transformation was a messy part rapper, part street boss. He couldn't fully leave the life that raised him. He had one foot in the booth and the other in the danger zone. By 19, Joey Crack was no longer just a name whispered in forest projects. He was performing in Bronx clubs, earning respect from other MCs. But every time he grabbed the mic, he carried the ghosts of the street with him. The bullet scars, the betrayals, the memories of running from his own father. He wasn't rapping for fame yet. He was rapping for survival, to find a voice that could free him from everything the Bronx had burned into him. That voice would soon turn him from a local legend into a national name and eventually lead him into the world that would change everything, the music industry. By 1992, Joseph Cartagena was standing at a crossroads. He'd survived the streets, the bullets, and the betrayals, but even survival started to feel like a trap. The Bronx had given him a name, but now that name was beginning to follow him like a curse. He was still known on the block, but now people saw him as something more than a rapper with real credibility. His freestyles had reached the ears of Diamond D, one of the Bronx's most respected producers and members of the legendary Diggin' in the Crates crew. Diamond saw what others didn't. Raw talent wrapped in scars. Joe's energy in the booth was explosive. He recorded a song called Flow Joe, a track that captured his story. Street-tested, confident, and hungry. The song hit the Bronx like wildfire. Radios picked it up, clubs spun it every night, and suddenly Joey Crack wasn't just a street name anymore. Relativity Records came calling with a 2-album deal worth $50,000. For the first time, Joe saw a legal way out. He signed the papers, took the advance, and swore that this time he was done with the dope game. He opened a sneaker store called Fat Joe's Halftime, and for once, his brother Angel Jr. and most of their old crew were indicted by federal agents. Angel barely escaped arrest because he was out of town. Joe had dodged disaster by inches. That was the moment he knew he couldn't go back. Music wasn't just a passion anymore, it was survival. He threw himself into recording his second album, Jealous One's Envy. One random afternoon, while buying a Diet Pepsi at a Bronx bodega, fate introduced him to someone who would change his life forever. Christopher Rios, known locally as Big Pun. Inside that corner store, Pun was rapping with his friends, his voice cutting through the noise of the street like thunder. His flow was sharp, fast, and poetic. Joe stood still, listening. When Pun finished, Joe walked straight up to him and said, "Yo, you coming with me?"
So I pull off, and then, he tell me his whole life story. And it was important for him to introduce me to his wife.
Yes.
So I went over there, I met his wife, and we talked, and later on that night, he came and got on my album. I put him on 2 joints on my album.
That meeting marked the birth of Terror Squad, not just a rap crew, but a movement. Joe saw in Pun what he once saw in himself, raw hunger and Bronx power. Alongside Pun came Cuban Link and Triple C's, and together, they built something new. But the name Terror Squad wasn't just for show. Long before the studio lights, that name belonged to the same violent crew that once ruled the projects.
Prospect, a.k.a. Sleepy Dog. Yeah. Triple Chase, the Beast. We got Cuban Link. We got Tony Sunshine. Armageddon, go by the name of Getty. And of course, BP, Big Pun.
Big Pun in the house.
It carried a reputation for fights, robberies, and revenge. Now that energy was being poured into music, but the street code didn't disappear. It just changed arenas. As Fat Joe and Big Pun's fame grew, so did their confidence. The Bronx had never been known for backing down, and Joe carried that energy into the industry. But fame brought enemies, and one of the biggest was Jay-Z. The tension began quietly. Joe believed Jay-Z had stolen a beat from his debut album and used it for his own track, Where I'm From, without credit. The disrespect burned, and when Jay-Z publicly named himself one of the top 3 MCs alongside Biggie and Nas, Joe felt excluded from a conversation he helped define. The quiet tension exploded one night at Club Carbon, one of New York's biggest hotspots. Both Terror Squad and Rockefeller were booked to perform. Words were exchanged, tempers rose, and before long, bottles flew through the air. Chaos erupted. Witnesses say Big Pun stormed through the crowd wielding a Rambo knife. People screamed and ducked for cover. Some claimed both Jay-Z and Damon Dash were hit by flying bottles during the melee. It wasn't just rap beef anymore, it was a Bronx-style street fight happening in the heart of the industry. Joe would later say, "I regret picking up a fight with Jay. All those years would have made money for the both of us."
Us and Rockefeller and all that was Fat Joe's doing, and I played myself, and I was wrong. And you know what? I wasted 10, 15 years. We could have got money with each other. Because I ain't gonna lie. Ever since I with Jay-Z,
you been getting that money.
The fallout was immediate. The industry began to fear Terror Squad not because of their lyrics, but because their reputation was real. If you disrespected them, consequences followed. But that same fear created cracks from within. While Joe was building the brand, Charlie Rock LD, his mentor and old friend, had just been released from a long prison bid. Joe welcomed him home with open arms, even buying him a car and a house, giving him a role in the Terror Squad organization. But the bond they once shared had changed. Charlie had been through hell behind bars. He'd lost an eye in a fight defending Joe's name, and when he came home, he found Joe living a different life, rich, busy, surrounded by people Charlie didn't recognize. The street loyalty that once defined their brotherhood was fading. Rumors spread that Charlie was using again, caught between addiction and bitterness. Joe called him a loose cannon. Charlie called it betrayal. Years of loyalty and pain came crashing down one night when Charlie showed up outside HOT 97, where Joe was doing an interview. He was armed, ready to end it all. But when their eyes met, Charlie froze. He couldn't do it. He turned and walked away, leaving behind decades of brotherhood in silence. For the first time, Joe saw what fame had cost him: not money, not respect, but the very people who built him. The same loyalty that once kept him alive was now pulling him apart from the inside. The code of the Bronx had followed him into fame, and no matter how much success he earned, that code never let him rest. By the late 90s, Fat Joe wasn't just a Bronx success story anymore, he was national. Jealous One's envy had done its job, and Don Cartagena took things to another level. The album went gold. His single Don Cartagena was everywhere, and Big Pun's debut Capital Punishment had just made history as the first platinum Latin rap album ever. The Bronx finally had a new empire, but behind the flashing cameras and radio hits, Joe's world was tightening like a noose. The streets that once gave him his name were watching closely, and not everyone was celebrating his rise. Success made him a target. People who once moved with him now whispered that Joe had gone Hollywood. The same corners where he'd once given out money and food started to feel hostile. And worse, some of those whispers were coming from inside Terror Squad itself. After Big Pun's death in 2000, the entire foundation cracked. Pun was the heart of the group, the one person who could calm Joe down when his temper exploded. Without him, the squad lost balance. Cuban Link felt cheated out of business deals. Remy Ma was caught between loyalty and survival, and Joe began hearing rumors that people close to him were plotting behind his back. Money, fame, and power had turned the crew into a war zone, and that's when the streets came knocking again. In 2001, Joe was driving through the Bronx when his SUV was sprayed with bullets. Over a dozen rounds ripped through the vehicle, one piercing the seat just inches from where he sat. No one was killed, but the message was clear. Someone wanted Joe gone. Detectives questioned him for hours, but Joe stayed silent. "I don't know nothing," he told them. It was the same code he'd grown up with. Handle it yourself. Never talk to police. Behind the scenes, Joe was trying to find out who pulled the trigger. Word spread fast. Some said it was over money, others said it was revenge for old beef. Either way, Joe doubled his security, stopped hanging out in certain spots, and rarely went anywhere without his bulletproof SUV. But the paranoia only grew worse. Around that same time, rumors hit the streets about a possible assassination plot against him, connected to a former associate he'd once helped. Joe brushed it off at first, but after another close call outside a Manhattan club, he began moving differently, always switching cars, never staying in one place too long. And as if that wasn't enough, a new storm was brewing in the music world, the Fat Joe versus 50 Cent beef. It all started after Joe appeared on Ja Rule's New York single in 2004. 50 Cent took it personally. At the time, 50 and Ja Rule were locked in one of hip-hop's biggest wars, and Fat Joe's feature made him an enemy by association. 50 fired the first shot, literally on wax, with his diss track, Piggy Bank. The video showed a cartoon Fat Joe as a pig being mocked by 50's character. It was brutal, disrespectful, and impossible to ignore. Joe didn't stay quiet. During the MTV Video Music Awards, right before he went on stage to present, he took the mic and said, "I want to thank all the police that's here tonight for protecting us from 50 Cent's G-Unit." He didn't stop there. He went on to say 50 was simply giving him publicity.
Guess what, Curtis? We just shipped another 250,000 just because of you. You making me hot, baby. 50dis.com, I love it. You making me hot.
Seconds later, 50 jumped up from his seat and started yelling across the room, throwing his hands in the air as security rushed in. Cameras cut away, but the tension was real. The entire arena felt like it was about to explode. After that night, things escalated fast. G-Unit members were dissing Terror Squad in interviews, and Joe wasn't backing down. The Bronx stood behind him, but the industry started pulling back. Promoters feared fights, and Joe's shows were getting canceled for security concerns. Behind closed doors, some of Joe's closest allies urged him to let it go, but Joe had lived his whole life fighting to be respected. Backing down wasn't an option. Still, he understood one thing: every beef had a cost. He'd already seen friends die, crews turn against each other, and bullets fly over pride. Now he was rich, but surrounded by ghosts. By 2006, after years of tension, Joe quietly began stepping away from street politics. He focused on rebuilding his label, supporting Remy Ma's career, and expanding beyond the Bronx. The fat kid who once fought over sneakers was now a millionaire with hits like Lean Back dominating charts worldwide. But even with all the success, the old instincts never left him. Joe once said in an interview, "You never stop looking over your shoulder. You just pray the shadow chasing you gets tired." And deep down, he knew in a world built on loyalty and betrayal, the price of survival was never truly paid. Just when it seemed like Fat Joe had survived every street war and industry feud, a new kind of battle appeared. One fought in courtrooms, not alleys. In early 2024, news broke that Terrence T.A. Dixon, Fat Joe's former hype man and longtime associate, had filed a $20 million lawsuit against the rapper. Dixon claimed years of coercion, manipulation, and unpaid labor, accusing Joe of exploiting his trust and mistreating him during their 12-year working relationship.
Rapper Fat Joe has been hit with an explosive $20 million lawsuit for allegedly coercing his ex-hype man into thousands of sexual acts. In a graphic 157-page lawsuit, Terrence T.A. Dixon accuses Fat Joe, whose legal name is Joseph Cartagena, of more than a decade of abuse. The details so disturbing that there's a big trigger warning in the red on the first page of that filing. Dixon alleges that in the lawsuit, Cartagena forced him to, quote, humiliating situations, including sex acts, performed under duress and surveillance.
The allegations didn't stop there. Court documents included disturbing claims that went far beyond business disputes, accusations of psychological abuse and intimidation that shocked fans and industry insiders alike. But Joe didn't stay silent. Within days, his legal team issued a firm statement, calling Dixon's story completely false and a shameless attempt at extortion. They insisted there was no truth to the accusations and that Joe had always treated his employees and friends with respect. The lawsuit also also mentioned Roc Nation, alleging the company ignored wrongdoing related to financial disputes, a claim that Roc Nation's representatives also denied. As the headlines spread, Joe refused to let the chaos pull him back into old habits. He stayed focused on business, music, and his growing family, appearing publicly calm and collected, while the legal process unfolded in the background. For a man who had faced bullets, betrayal, and the Bronx's harshest lessons, this was just another test of endurance, proof that sometimes the most dangerous battles don't happen in the streets, but in the system. By 2013, Fat Joe had already lived several lives: the hustler, the rapper, the boss, and the survivor. But when he was sentenced to 4 months in federal prison for tax evasion, it marked a turning point. It wasn't the length of the sentence that mattered, but what it represented: a final reckoning with everything he'd built and lost.
For 4 months in a cell and all I could do was think, I came up with the whole plan. And so what you see now, when you be like, yo, Joe's a great businessman, Joe's just, I did it there.
He served his time in the general population, refusing protective custody despite the risks. For a man who once led a feared Bronx crew, that choice was about principle. When he walked out in November 2013, the fame was still there, but the foundation had changed. The money wasn't the same, the loyalty wasn't the same, and the people around him were fewer.
The moment that flipped the switch and set them down a specific path, Joe, what was that moment for you?
I went to jail. At that, I've been guilty of every crime except for rape or murder. Everything else, I done robbed, sold drugs, scam, everything you could possibly do. I'm damn near crime expert, but I literally went to jail for something I ain't do.
One of the hardest blows came from within his own circle. His close friend and longtime associate, Macho, was accused of stealing from him. For years, Macho had handled business alongside Joe, so the betrayal hit deep.
Right, I had an accountant that robbed me and wasn't paying my taxes, and I had to go to jail for him. Then I had to pay back the money that he stole from me to give it to the IRS before I went there. Then they gave me a penalty, $1 million penalty.
But instead of responding with anger or retaliation, Joe cut ties quietly and moved on. It was a rare moment of restraint from a man once known for reacting fast and hard. Not long after, another chapter from his past returned. Charlie Rock LD, once his closest ally and street protector. Charlie had grown distant and resentful. At one point, the tension between them almost escalated into violence. But it didn't. Both men walked away. It was clear that time and experience had changed them. As the years passed, Joe focused on rebuilding through music and business. His feud with 50 Cent, one of the most public in hip-hop, eventually ended. The two shared a stage in 2023 during 50's Final Lap tour, a symbolic moment showing how far both had come. In 2016, Fat Joe and Remy Ma released All the Way Up, a record that reignited their careers and re-established Joe's place in the industry. The success led to new ventures, including his sneaker store, Up NYC, and opened doors for him beyond music. Today, Joseph Cartagena is recognized less for controversy and more for consistency. He's active in the community, speaks openly about mental health, and mentors younger artists on the importance of discipline and longevity. The Bronx kid who once lived by the code of the street now lives by a different one, who works hard, stays grounded, and takes care of what matters. His story no longer ends in survival, but in balance.